Hello, and welcome to today's quick discussion on the conflict brought about by World War II on the home front amongst minorities and displaced Jewish refugees. I would like to start by looking at some propaganda released between the years of 1935 and 1939 and 1945, which depict how necessary it was for all Americans to participate in the war effort to make things run more smoothly and to ensure that things didn't fall apart while men were away at war. And in these propaganda posters, you can see how everybody was encouraged to join in on, you know, just actively participate in helping out no matter what race or ethnicity they were, or whether they were male, female, or child. Everybody was expected to contribute and help out. Okay, with that being said, everybody was encouraged to join in, including men who were being drafted for the war at this time. And while minorities were discriminated against in the armed forces, they were still desperately needed. And they still became part of the American military and were allowed to fight overseas. Now, that doesn't apply to most every colored person who was in the armed forces. Mostly it applied to Asian Americans and somewhat to Hispanic Americans, and we'll get to African Americans later on. But the few Hispanic Americans who were involved in the war were, like I said, few, far, and in between. Mostly Mexican Americans contributed unknowingly to the war effort, some of them through labor and agricultural contributions. I say unknowingly because I don't think many of them realized that they were but a small role in the government's agenda for recovering the economy due to agricultural losses, since before the war, agriculture was in a decline, and lawmakers saw the value in Mexican labor and did what they could in order to secure it and make sure that there was a constant influx of crops for the war. In this document, you can see what I mean, where the writer says, this farming area and other vital war crops are seriously short of farm labor. And he goes on to say, this help absolutely necessary to harvest vitally essential war crops. Can deportation be stayed temporarily? Now, I think this shows how desperately the United States was in need of crops harvested by Mexican laborers. More so, another thing which shows how desperate the United States was the Bracero program, which was a recruitment of Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican immigrants into the United States, and they basically just harvested crops during the 30s and 40s, and whenever the United States did not need them anymore, they were deported and taken back to their home in the 1950s. However, some of them did stay in search of the American dream. Among those who greatly contributed to the war on the home front were women. Wartime granted women much more mobility and freedom to enter the workforce and the armed forces and have an opportunity to provide for their families. African American women especially experienced an improvement in employment, securing jobs at factories, mills, and even as welders. However, opinions on African Americans did not change with the onset of war. Men who did enlist in the military were given menial tasks to perform and rarely made it onto the battlefield. The American Red Cross did not allow donations from African Americans due to the preconceived notion that their blood was tainted or different from that of a white man. This shows how deep the hatred for African Americans still is at this time, and how, in trying times, the true way whites felt about African Americans surfaced despite improvements in civil rights. Luckily, African Americans remained confident that they could one day receive equal treatment and continue to push for civil rights, even though lawmakers kind of put civil rights legislation on the back burner and didn't really think to worry about it because it wasn't important to them. And as a result, the nation saw a rise in sit-ins and nonviolent protests on behalf of African Americans. I think for African Americans, it didn't matter that what was going on overseas or that the country was at war. You know, they still deserved to be treated the way everybody else was treated. They wanted equality and they deserved it. And just because there was a war, it didn't mean that the nation should regress on civil rights and continue to treat African Americans in such a negative, derogatory manner. And I do think that's why sit ins and protests started to grow, because African Americans were beginning to see the extreme hatred that Americans had for them, that they thought, went away over time, and that they were making progress to overcome, and that Americans accepted them. Well, more so whites than Americans, but that whites were beginning to see them equally. And now all of a sudden, the war has brought up these negative opinions, and it was a motivating factor for African Americans to sort of step up their game and remind whites that they were still there, they still demanded equality, and that they were not going to give up until they achieved their goal of racial equality and fair treatment. African Americans and Mexicans were not the only people of color to be treated unfairly by whites. Jews were stereotyped as communists who take jobs from American citizens. In the case of one man who arrived in the United States days after the start of the war, a council questioned him on why and specifically when he came to the United States, thinking he might be a communist trying to attack the country from inside. And much like African Americans and Hispanics, Jewish people didn't really have a place in society. Immigration limits were getting lower every year, making it increasingly more difficult for Jews to make America their new home. And after the war, or once the war began and the world saw what was happening in Germany and Poland and everywhere else, it became really important that the Allied countries open their borders to refugees. Here we see a boat of refugees heading to the United States. And here we can see what these displaced individuals faced upon arrival in America. Americans saw that the Jewish were not trying to impose communist ideals on the US, but that the Jewish people were victims and desperately in need of help. But schemas rarely change, and if they do, it takes a long time. These two images are equally revealing of the indifference of the government to Jewish plight. One reads, "The American relief ships in the war zone are for the evacuation of American citizens. Each ship is overcrowded with Americans." The other one says, "The State Department does not interfere with granting visas. This is in the hands of the consuls abroad." Both cases show that the government fails to take action to try and save as many Jews as they can, nor take responsibility for turning the Jewish people away just because the United States had a limit of how many immigrants were allowed into the country per year. And it's very clear that the United States could have done more to save Holocaust victims and at least provide them a home or a shelter where they can be safe and away from the Nazis and the war. But they didn't, and even American Jews in the United States wanted to help out and wanted to do something, but they were afraid that if they spoke out, it would incite anti Semitic opinions amongst Americans and in turn just make everything so much worse and cause the US government to not want to help Holocaust victims whatsoever. So they just kind of left it as it is. But the United States, at the time, they knew about what was happening to the Jewish people. They could have saved many people before they were sent, these people were sent to the concentration camps. And yet, once they realized that the Jewish were not dangerous people and they were just victims, it was too late. And they were already being sent to the concentration camps, and Germany and Poland had closed their borders and were not allowing anybody to leave. So we see that the war has brought up many negative opinions and repressed feelings towards certain ethnic and racial groups, and has also had both a positive and negative impact on those on the home front who were just trying to aid the war effort and continue to live their life without being discriminated against or treated any differently than whites would treat each other. Many of these groups, I think, expected the war to be an opportunity where they would be kind of looked over and the color of their skin would be overlooked and they would receive impartial treatment and could go about their business and contribute to society just like everybody else. However, that's not the fate they met, which was disappointing for some in the case of the Jewish people. However, in the case of African Americans, they stood up to the challenge and really showed that they were not going to let this war stand in the way of their fight for equality. Okay, so that concludes this podcast. Thank you for listening.